Yoselin Ortega, a live-in nanny in New York City, cared for the Krim children in their Upper West Side home. On October 25, 2012, that trust turned into tragedy. While looking after 6-year-old Lucia and 2-year-old Leo, Ortega stabbed both children inside the apartment. Their mother, Marina Krim, returned from a swim class with her youngest child and walked into a nightmare. Her 2 children murdered in the bathroom. The trial evolved into one of New York's most sensational cases, capturing the attention of the nation. Yoselin Ortega's defense argued that she was mentally ill and therefore not accountable for her horrific actions. However, prosecutors vehemently maintained that the murders were deliberate and premeditated. After 6 years of legal battles, in April 2018, a Manhattan jury, after careful deliberation, found Ortega guilty on multiple counts, reflecting the gravity and chilling intent behind her actions. The verdict led to a life sentence without parole, underscoring the unthinkable nature of the crime and ensuring that Ortega would never walk free again. Case 2. Victoria Fox was trusted to watch over a newborn in San Diego, but in May 2021, she committed an unthinkable act. While the baby's parents were at the hospital welcoming twins through a surrogate, Fox shook and slammed their 4-week-old infant with such force that the child suffered fatal injuries. Instead of rushing to help, she paused to eat lunch before finally seeking medical attention. What should have been the happiest day of that family's life became the darkest, all because the caregiver they relied on turned into the source of their tragedy. 2 years later, in October 2023, a San Diego County judge solemnly sentenced Victoria Fox to 25 years to life in prison. During the gripping trial, medical experts presented extremely painful testimony, revealing that the infant's extensive injuries were consistent with abusive head trauma, painting a heartbreaking picture of the tragedy. The jury, after carefully deliberating the evidence, found her guilty of second-degree murder. Meanwhile, the baby's devastated parents, who had just begun celebrating the arrival of their long-awaited twins, returned home with joy in their hearts, only to be met with the shattering news that their beloved firstborn had been killed by the very individual they had entrusted to ensure his safety. The weight of betrayal and loss hung heavily in the air, a haunting reminder of their terrible ordeal. Case 3. Lindsay Parton, a babysitter in Butler County, Ohio, was trusted to watch over 3-year-old Hannah Wesha. On March 8, 2018, that trust ended in tragedy. Hannah was rushed from Parton's home after being found unresponsive, and doctors discovered she had severe brain injuries and bruises across her body. Placed on life support, the little girl clung to life for 10 days before passing away, turning a routine day of childcare into the start of a homicide case. In April 2019, prosecutors told jurors that Parton struck Hannah with such force that it caused fatal bleeding in her brain. They also pointed to evidence of repeated abuse. The defense argued the injuries might have been caused by a sudden medical collapse or a fall, but jurors sided with the state. After hearing testimony from doctors, investigators, and Hannah's father, the jury convicted Parton of murder, involuntary manslaughter, and 4 counts of child endangerment. On May 9, 2019, she was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 years. The legal battle surrounding Lindsay Parton extended far beyond her sentencing. In 2020, an appeals court controversially vacated her conviction, pointing to alleged errors that transpired during the trial. However, in a powerful turn of events, the Ohio Supreme Court reinstated her conviction in 2021, affirming the strength of the evidence that had been presented. By the way, I'm going to be posting a lot more interesting videos on the channel. I'll greatly appreciate it if you could show support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thank you. Case 4. Marissa Teetsort was once trusted by parents in Wausau, Wisconsin, to care for their children, but on October 18, 2018, that trust was shattered in the worst way. Left alone with a 2-month-old boy, she caused fatal head injuries and a broken tailbone. Instead of seeking help, she zipped the baby into a snowsuit, strapped him into a car seat, and pulled a hat over his eyes to make it look like he was sleeping. When the infant's mother arrived to pick him up, she was handed her son back without knowing he had already been dead for hours. Investigators soon revealed that this wasn't Teetsort's first act of violence. Court records showed she had a history of harming children in her care, including a separate case involving a young girl. In fact, when she was left alone with the infant, she was already facing pending charges for earlier abuse. Prosecutors argued that her actions on that October day were not an accident, but a pattern of cruelty that finally claimed a life. After years of legal proceedings, Teetsort pleaded guilty in November 2021 to first-degree reckless homicide and child abuse charges. On March 8, 2022, a judge sentenced her to 40 years in prison, followed by 20 years of extended supervision. Case 5. Terry McCurchie was a babysitter in Broward County, Florida, whose name became tied to a tragedy that began in 1984. While caring for 5-month-old Benjamin Dowling, she shook him so violently that he was left with catastrophic brain damage. The baby lost his sight, could never speak, and would require full-time care for the rest of his life. For Benjamin's parents, that single act turned what should have been an ordinary day of childcare into a lifetime of pain and struggle. For years, McCurchie lived freely in Texas, raising children of her own and even working as a medical assistant, while Benjamin's parents devoted themselves to keeping him alive. Their son's health remained fragile, and in September 2019, at just 35 years old, Benjamin died. Medical examiners confirmed that his death was directly caused by the brain injuries inflicted decades earlier. That ruling gave prosecutors the ability to reopen the case and pursue new charges against the woman who had shaken him as an infant. A Broward County grand jury charged McCurchie in 2021 with first-degree murder, signaling the seriousness of her alleged crime. However, by August 2024, she chose to accept a plea deal, admitting to manslaughter. This decision allowed her to avoid a potential life sentence, resulting in a surprisingly lenient sentence of just 3 years in prison. Case 6. Ada Betty Quadros Fernandez, a nanny in McKinney just outside Dallas, Texas, took responsibility for caring for 14-month-old Kyle Lazarchik. On October 13, 2005, she dialed 911 claiming Kyle was choking and had suddenly collapsed. But when doctors examined the toddler, they uncovered something far more alarming: severe head trauma caused by blunt force. 2 days later, Kyle died from his injuries, and suspicion turned quickly to the woman meant to protect him. Quadros Fernandez was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole in 2006. But 3 years later, in 2009, an appeals court overturned the conviction, ruling that errors in the original trial had denied her a fair defense. The case returned to court in 2012. Prosecutors argued that Kyle's injuries could not have been accidental, pointing to multiple impact wounds and a cracked kitchen cabinet door in her home that matched the child's injuries. Defense attorneys suggested the toddler might have fallen, but jurors rejected that explanation. After 5.5 hours of deliberation, the jury once again found her guilty of capital murder. Case 7. Leah Walden, only 23 years old and working at a Baltimore daycare, stepped into history for all the wrong reasons when her name became linked to one of the city's most disturbing childcare crimes. On May 23, 2017, at the Rocketeers Learning Center, surveillance cameras captured her violently handling 8-month-old Reese Bowman, turning an ordinary day into a moment that would horrify parents everywhere. The video showed her slapping the baby, forcefully moving him, and finally smothering him with a blanket until he stopped breathing. When investigators reviewed the footage, they described it as deliberate and heartless. Reese's parents believed their son was in safe hands, but that trust ended in tragedy. Court records revealed the extent of Walden's cruelty. Prosecutors said she left Reese motionless in his crib and walked away without trying to get help. The images from the surveillance camera left no doubt about what happened in those final minutes of the baby's life. In March 2018, Walden pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and first-degree child abuse resulting in death. A Baltimore judge sentenced her to 70 years in prison, one of the harshest punishments ever handed down to a childcare worker in the U.S. By the way, just before we get into the next case, please comment where you're watching from. I'd love to say hello to you in the comments. Thank you. Case 8. Ashley Chapman was once a babysitter in Hardin County, Kentucky. On January 25, 2012, she was caring for 2-year-old Layla Johnson at her home in Vine Grove. Layla was found unresponsive and covered in bruises. Family rushed her for help, and doctors moved her to Caregivers Children's Hospital in Louisville. A few days later, Layla died from her injuries. What looked like a normal day of babysitting became a homicide case. Police said the child had been struck and shaken. Early reports showed severe head trauma and widespread bruising. The case drew strong attention in the area. People wanted to know how a trusted caregiver could allow such harm. Newsrooms followed every step as the investigation moved from the first questions to a murder charge. In late January and early February 2012, charges were upgraded from criminal abuse to murder. Chapman was arrested, arraigned, and at first pled not guilty. Court records and news reports show repeat hearings through the spring of 2012, all tied to the death of 2-year-old Layla. On November 14, 2012, Chapman changed her plea and admitted guilt to murder in Hardin Circuit Court. Prosecutors recommended 35 years in prison. 1 month later, on December 13, 2012, the judge sentenced her to 35 years. Case 9. Melissa Kalasinski, only 22 years old and working at a Lincolnshire daycare, stepped into a day that would change everything on January 14, 2009. That afternoon, 16-month-old Benjamin Ben Kingan collapsed inside the Maine Subi Day Care Center, transforming a routine shift into the beginning of a heartbreaking case that drew national attention. Staff tried to revive him, and he was rushed to the hospital. Despite efforts, Ben was pronounced dead. The community was stunned as parents asked how a toddler could die so suddenly in a licensed daycare setting. Doctors who examined Ben found a fractured skull and bleeding in his brain. The pathologist testified that the injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma and had occurred within hours of his death. Investigators interrogated Melissa for 9 hours. During questioning, she denied harming the child dozens of times. But under pressure, she eventually confessed that she had thrown Ben to the ground. She later recanted, saying the confession was false and coerced. Her case went to trial in November 2011 in Lake County, Illinois. Prosecutors argued that Melissa caused Ben's fatal injuries by slamming him, pointing to expert testimony that the skull fracture was fresh. The defense countered that Ben had a history of medical issues and a prior head injury months before his death. They argued the evidence was misread and Melissa was pressured into a false confession. After about 7 hours of jury deliberation, Melissa was convicted of first-degree murder and aggravated battery of a child. She was sentenced to 31 years in prison. Case 10. Jessica Tata was a 22-year-old home daycare operator in Houston, Texas, when her negligence led to one of the deadliest childcare tragedies in the state's history. On February 24, 2011, she left 7 toddlers alone in her care while she went shopping. A pan of oil was left heating on the stove. It caught fire, and within minutes, the small home daycare was engulfed in flames. 4 children were killed and 3 others badly injured before firefighters could pull them from the smoke. When investigators pieced the story together, they discovered Tata had a history of leaving children unsupervised. Instead of calling for help immediately, she fled the burning home and later escaped the country, flying to Nigeria. A nationwide manhunt began, and after weeks on the run, she was captured and extradited to the United States. Tata's trial ended in October 2012 with a felony murder conviction tied to the death of 16-month-old Elias Castillo, one of the children lost in the fire. The following year, she received an 80-year prison sentence, alongside additional convictions for child abandonment, injury to a child, and reckless conduct. The judge's ruling ensured she would spend most of her life behind bars. Case 11. Cheyenne J. Chatlos, an in-home daycare provider in Virginia Beach, Virginia, came under scrutiny on September 17, 2019. That day, she was caring for a 4-month-old baby when a 911 call reported the infant unresponsive. The child was rushed to Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters, but died days later. Doctors found brain bleeding, retinal hemorrhages, broken fingers, bruising, and a black eye, injuries consistent with violent abuse. The investigation quickly turned to Chatlos. Prosecutors said her accounts of what happened that day shifted over time, and the medical evidence proved the child's injuries were caused while in her care. Forensic specialists ruled out natural causes and pointed to abusive head trauma as the reason for the baby's death. In court, prosecutors described the injuries as deliberate and devastating. Chatlos denied harming the child, but her explanations failed to convince the jury. A Virginia Beach jury delivered its verdict on November 2, 2023, finding Cheyenne J. Xatlos guilty of second-degree felony murder, along with child abuse and neglect. On May 30, 2024, Judge Afshin Farashahi sentenced her to 50 years in prison, with 22 years suspended, leaving 28 years to serve. The court went beyond Virginia's sentencing guidelines, which recommended a maximum of just over 22 years, citing the severity of the crime. Case 12. Dixie Denise Villa was a babysitter in Honolulu, Hawaii, whose actions ended in the tragic death of 7-month-old Abigail Lobish. In 2019, Villa gave the infant a dose of diphenhydramine, the active ingredient in Benadryl, even though it had not been prescribed by a doctor. Medical examiners later confirmed that the amount given was far beyond safe levels, leaving Abigail with a toxic concentration of the drug in her system. The little girl never woke up. Prosecutors argued that Villa was caring for multiple children at the time and used the medication to keep Abigail quiet. The defense insisted it was a mistake, but the jury saw it differently. After a 3-day deliberation in November 2024, Villa was convicted of manslaughter. In emotional testimony during the trial, Abigail's mother, Anna Lobish, described the unending pain of losing her baby, telling the court that her heart would never stop hurting. On May 7, 2025, the judge delivered the maximum penalty for manslaughter under Hawaii law, 20 years in prison. Villa had sought a new trial, claiming problems with evidence and testimony, but that request was denied just weeks before her sentencing. Case 13. Caleb Lane Nix, a babysitter in Fort Worth, Texas, entered family homes through online babysitting platforms, taking on the responsibility of watching children whose parents trusted him. But in 2024, investigators revealed that Nix had secretly filmed himself sexually abusing young children in his care. Federal prosecutors called his crimes some of the most disturbing they had ever seen. In December 2024, a federal judge sentenced him to 60 years in prison for sexual exploitation of children. The case began when the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children received a cyber tip about child sexual abuse material posted online. Homeland Security and local police traced the files back to Nix. When they searched his phone, they discovered videos of him abusing children as young as 3 years old. Court records show that at least 15 victims were identified. Investigators also uncovered tens of thousands of images and videos stored on his devices, showing both his own crimes and other material he had collected. In November 2024, Nix pleaded guilty in federal court to 2 counts of sexual exploitation of children. At sentencing, U.S. District Judge Mark Pittman gave him 2 30-year terms, ordered to run one after the other. That made a total of 720 months, 60 years in prison. Prosecutors noted that the sentence went far beyond the minimum because of the scale of the abuse and the number of children harmed. Case 14. Brittany Mae Lyon, working as a babysitter in San Diego County, California, drew headlines when her crimes shocked the community and shattered the trust of the families who once relied on her. On May 16, 2025, she was sentenced to 100 years to life in prison after pleading guilty to charges of procuring multiple young girls, including children with autism and other special needs, for sexual abuse by her boyfriend, Samuel Cabrera. Prosecutors revealed that Lyon not only arranged for the abuse, but also took part in it herself, violating the trust of families who believed their children were safe in her care. The investigation began when a 7-year-old girl told her mother she didn't want to return to Lyon's house. Police later discovered a locked box in Cabrera's car containing 6 hard drives. These drives held hundreds of videos documenting the abuse of at least 4 children. The disturbing footage showed that drugs and violence were used to control the victims. Lyon admitted guilt to multiple charges, including sexual abuse of children, kidnapping, burglary, and residential intrusion. Cabrera had already been convicted in 2019 and was serving multiple life sentences without parole. Lyon's sentencing in 2025 marked one of the harshest punishments ever given to a childcare provider in the U.S. Still, under California's elder parole law, she could technically petition for parole at age 50. Case 15. McCallie Elizabeth Durham, a babysitter in Harrison County, Mississippi, took on the responsibility of caring for 2 young children, a role that carried the trust of their family but would soon collapse into tragedy. On September 13th, 2022, first responders were called to a home where a 2-year-old boy was found unresponsive. An 11-month-old girl in the same home was also discovered injured but alive. The toddler was rushed to the hospital with signs of severe head trauma and multiple bruises. Despite emergency efforts, he later died from his injuries. Investigators learned that the violence had not been a single incident. Court documents revealed that Durham struck the boy in the face and head on 3 different dates, September 9th, 12th, and 13th, 2022. The repeated blows caused the fatal injuries. The baby girl also suffered abuse, beaten over several days during the same period. Prosecutors argued that the assaults were deliberate and amounted to torture. Durham was indicted on charges of capital murder for the toddler's death and multiple counts of felonious child abuse for the injuries to the infant. A guilty plea to capital murder and 4 counts of child abuse came from Durham in December 2024. A Mississippi judge sentenced her to life without the possibility of parole for the murder, plus 40 additional years for the child abuse charges. Case 16. Gloria Fields was a Staten Island babysitter whose crime shocked New York. Between February 19th and 21st, 2016, she tortured 17-month-old Anthony Delgado while he was in her care. Over those days, she inflicted blunt force trauma by shaking him, slamming him, and throwing him, and also inserted a pencil into his anus and rectum, causing internal lacerations. When Anthony's grandmother found him unresponsive, he was rushed to Staten Island University Hospital, but the injuries were too severe. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide, citing the extensive trauma that covered his entire body, except his feet. In court documents, prosecutors described the abuse as systematic and prolonged, occurring at the babysitter's apartment and another location tied to her. In April 2018, Fields pleaded guilty to first-degree murder for the torture and killing of Anthony Delgado. Later that month, she was sentenced to 23 years to life in prison by Justice Wayne Ozzie. During sentencing, the judge called it one of the most disturbing cases he had ever handled, and the courtroom erupted in emotion as the sentence was read. Case 17. Jason Mark Janach, a daycare worker and freelance babysitter in Oklahoma City, gained the trust of parents who relied on him to care for their young children, a trust that would later be shattered most disturbingly. But in 2015, investigators discovered that he had crossed one of the darkest lines imaginable. While babysitting an 18-month-old toddler, Janach produced sexually explicit images of the child and then sent those files through the messaging app Kik to a contact in New Zealand. His actions turned a position of trust into a platform for exploitation. Federal authorities built their case after tracing online activity tied to the Kik username, the lover of the little. Homeland Security investigations worked with New Zealand police and connected the account to Janach, who was advertising babysitting services on platforms like Sitter.com and Care.com. In February 2016, Janach admitted in court that he had photographed the toddler while babysitting and transmitted the images abroad. Prosecutors also revealed troubling evidence. He had previously molested a 3-year-old girl and conducted internet searches for disturbing terms involving children. A federal judge in October 2016 sentenced Janach to 30 years in prison for producing child pornography, the maximum penalty permitted, and imposed lifetime supervised release. He was also ordered to register as a sex offender and pay a $5,000 special assessment. Case 18. Amanda Hickey once ran a small daycare in Dunwoody, Georgia, called Little Lovey. Parents thought they were leaving their babies in safe hands. But in February 2021, tragedy struck when 4-month-old Charlie Cronmiller died under her care. By 2023, Hickey would be standing in court, facing the consequences of a crime that forever changed a family and shocked a community. Charlie was found unresponsive at the daycare on February 3, 2021. Prosecutors later revealed that Hickey's handling of the child violated safe sleep practices. Surveillance evidence contradicted her claims of how she put him down. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered disturbing allegations. Hickey had mistreated at least 6 other babies between the ages of 6 and 16 months. Parents who once trusted her were blindsided by the horrifying details that came to light. In September 2023, Hickey entered guilty pleas to several charges, including cruelty to children and reckless conduct. She also entered an Alford plea to second-degree murder and additional child cruelty counts, meaning she did not admit guilt but acknowledged the evidence was overwhelming. In October 2023, a DeKalb County judge sentenced her to 35 years, with 30 years to serve in prison and the remaining time on probation. Case 19. Lauren Courtney was hired as a babysitter in Las Vegas, Nevada. In March 2021, she was supposed to watch over a 5-year-old boy named Ryan Peralto. But what unfolded inside that apartment shocked the entire community. By 2022, Courtney would be sentenced to life in prison for first-degree murder, her actions caught on security footage that revealed the horrifying truth. On March 11, 2021, police rushed to the Peralto home after a frantic call. Inside, 5-year-old Ryan was found unresponsive and gravely injured. Prosecutors later revealed that security cameras captured Courtney violently attacking him, kicking, slapping, and dragging him while shouting. The video showed repeated assaults that left the boy's small body battered. Medical reports confirmed devastating injuries: a skull fracture, brain bleed, fractured spleen, and internal organ damage. Despite emergency care, Ryan could not be saved. Lauren Courtney was arrested the same day and charged with murder. Facing overwhelming evidence, she entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder in October 2022, avoiding a lengthy trial. In December 2022, a Clark County judge sentenced her to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Case 20. Stacy Vaillancourt, a daycare worker in Rutland, Vermont, faced public outrage after the death of 6-month-old Harper Rose Breyer in January 2019. Parents left their daughter in her care, but tragedy struck when the baby never came home. Investigators later revealed that Vaillancourt had given Harper a fatal dose of diphenhydramine, the active ingredient in Benadryl. By 2020, she stood charged with manslaughter, her reckless actions leaving a family devastated and a community demanding answers. On January 24, 2019, 6-month-old Harper was dropped off at Vaillancourt's in-home daycare. Hours later, she was found unresponsive. Doctors could not save her. An autopsy revealed the cause of death: diphenhydramine intoxication, the active ingredient in Benadryl. Investigators learned that Vaillancourt had been using the drug on children in her care to keep them drowsy, a shortcut that turned deadly. The news sent shockwaves through the Vermont community. Vaillancourt was charged with involuntary manslaughter and child cruelty, with death resulting. In December 2023, a jury found her guilty on both counts. The following March, she was sentenced to 3 to 10 years in prison. In May 2025, the Vermont Supreme Court upheld Vaillancourt's convictions, rejecting her appeal. Case 21. Rosalinda Ganseres offered her services as a babysitter in Corpus Christi, Texas. Parents thought they were leaving their children in safe hands. Instead, she became part of a disturbing crime that horrified even seasoned investigators. By September 2016, Ganseres stood before a federal judge and was sentenced to 30 years in prison for producing child sexual abuse material, an unforgivable betrayal of trust. It started with a Craigslist advertisement. Ganseres and her boyfriend posted an offer to babysit, presenting themselves as ordinary caregivers. A mother, searching for help, responded to the ad. But what seemed like an innocent arrangement turned into every parent's nightmare. Federal investigators later revealed that while babysitting, Ganseres recorded the abuse of a young child at the hands of her boyfriend. Instead of protecting the child, she participated in creating explicit recordings that were later uncovered by authorities. A federal court on June 8, 2016, heard Ganseres plead guilty to sexual exploitation of a child, considered one of the harshest charges in the system. Prosecutors explained that her involvement was deliberate. She knowingly created child pornography while in a position of trust. In court, the evidence was undeniable, and the plea spared the victim's family from a lengthy trial. On September 26, 2016, the federal judge sentenced Rosalinda Ganseres to 30 years in prison, the maximum allowed by law. She was also ordered to serve 10 years of supervised release after completing her sentence, and she will be required to register as a sex offender. Case 22. Gray Mendez ran a Bronx daycare called Divino Niño. Parents thought it was a safe place for toddlers to nap and play. But in September 2023, one baby died and 3 others were hospitalized. poisoned by fentanyl that had been hidden under the playroom floor. In March 2025, Mendez was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison for running a drug operation out of her daycare, a case that shocked New York and the nation. Between June 2022 and September 2023, prosecutors say Mendez and her husband stored fentanyl and heroin in hidden compartments beneath the daycare floor. Investigators later uncovered over 11 kilograms of drugs stashed under mats where children played and slept. On September 15, 2023, 4 children under the age of 3 were exposed to narcotics. 3 survived after emergency treatment. But 22-month-old Nicholas Feliz Dominici died, his tiny body overwhelmed by the lethal drug. By October 2024, Mendez formally pled guilty to conspiracy to distribute narcotics tied to death and serious injury, as well as other connected federal charges. Prosecutors argued that she had chosen profit over safety, placing babies directly in harm's way. On March 3, 2025, Judge Jed S. Rakoff sentenced her to 45 years in prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. Her husband received the same punishment for his role in the deadly conspiracy. Case 23. Louise Woodward, a 19-year-old au pair from England, arrived in Massachusetts in 1996 to care for 8-month-old Matthew Epen. Just months later, the baby was rushed to a Boston hospital with severe head injuries. By February 1997, Matthew was dead, and Woodward was accused of murder. The case would spark international headlines, fierce debate among medical experts, and one of the most controversial verdicts of the decade. On February 4, 1997, Matthew was found unresponsive and taken to the Children's Hospital in Boston. Doctors discovered a fractured skull, bleeding behind the eyes, and swelling in the brain, injuries they said were consistent with violent shaking. Matthew died 5 days later. Prosecutors argued that Woodward had lost her temper while caring for him and inflicted what was then called shaken baby syndrome. The defense countered that Matthew's injuries could have come from an earlier accident, creating doubt and dividing experts on the stand. The trial began in October 1997 and gripped audiences around the world. On October 30, 1997, the jury convicted Woodward of second-degree murder, a verdict that carried a mandatory life sentence in Massachusetts. But just 5 days later, Judge Hiller Zobel took the rare step of reducing the conviction. He ruled that the evidence did not prove malice and changed the charge to involuntary manslaughter. Woodward was sentenced to time served, 279 days in jail, and released. Soon after, she returned to England, free but forever tied to the case. If you enjoyed this video, I'm going to be posting a lot more interesting videos on the channel. I'd greatly appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Thank you very much.